Chess friends, I hope you are doing well. Today, I have another chess game of Stockfish 18 beta, which I played against my own old version, Stockfish 17, and you can access my Stockfish 18 chess games from my website. This game is very amazing because I initiated a new chess opening gambit in which I sacrificed my 2 bishops one by one. I sacrificed my 2 bishops in a row against my old version, so, let's get started without wasting any time. I started the game with e4, and my brother played e5. And then he went with knight to c6 to assert control over the center. Bishop to c4 follows in the game, where it attacks the pawn on f7 with the possibility of moving the knight to g5. Then, you can also play d3, and the knight on its usual square may go with the elephant variation with this kind of move. The bishop went out to the c5 square, asserting control over the diagonal, and many players might think of considering knight takes e5, which is also a chess gambit where you can then play d4. But hold on, knight takes e5 is not so good because after black captures it, black will immediately create pressure on the bishop. That's the reason why I decided to play the c3 move, which opens up my queen's diagonal and also prepares for d4 while putting the knight on the d2 square. Black plays knight to f6, attacking the pawn, and then I go with d4, putting pressure on the center. After the exchanges, I secured my 2 center pawns, asserting dominance over the central squares. The bishop has to move, and Stockfish saves the bishop with a tempo, and we have bishop to d2. Here, many players might consider knight takes e4, as the pawn is vulnerable, and it also creates pressure on the bishop. And do you know what move I should consider here? I will sacrifice my bishop right on the board with bishop takes f7. After you capture it, I will consider bishop takes b4, and then after you capture, there is queen to b3 check, and it will win the knight. Also, your king is left without the option of castling. You will face tremendous problems, therefore, in this position, knight takes e4 is not so good. After castling happened in the game, black is posing the threat of capturing the pawn. That's the reason why we have e5, putting pressure on the knight. Where should the knight go? Think for a moment. The knight moves back to the e8 square, and you can also notice that the pawn on f7 is pinned. Therefore, I played with my masterful genius mind and went knight to c3. This knight to c3 move is very crucial because it blocks the bishop's attack, and also, if you capture the knight, I will be left with a 2-bishop pair that will protect these pawns. Also, I am posing the threat of playing bishop to g5 to attack the queen, since your pawn on f7 is pinned to the king. You will face tremendous problems for the queen. Alright, as you can see here, we have d6, opening up the bishop diagonal. Alright. We have now a3. Now, here is a question for you: should you capture the knight or not? Capturing the knight is not good because I will get my bishop active there, and as soon as the bishop is left on a5, it goes back to the b6 square, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. Since my pawns are very advanced and my knights are very active, and I have an open diagonal for my bishop while black's knight position is very passive and bad, I decided to assert more control by playing bishop to g5, putting pressure on the queen. You can see that the bishop is protected by the knight. The pawn cannot move because the f7 pawn is pinned to the king, therefore, the queen has to move. Another possible move that many players might consider is knight to e7. Let me show you the variation, but it is a very bad move because now I can play knight to d5, putting more pressure on the e7 knight, and you will face vulnerabilities. Let me further explore the variation. Some chess players might consider f6, but hold on, I can play knight takes f6, delivering a double check to the king. And as soon as the king slides away, knight to d5 will arrive, putting more pressure on the e7 knight. Your position will be just very bad. Your bad luck will come. Going back to the variation, we discovered that the knight cannot block here. Therefore, the queen goes up to the d7 square to eat some chocolate ice cream. The center is well protected by the knight, and also, my pawn is asserting more pressure on these squares. The bishop has a very good diagonal, my knight is very active. So, can you guess what move I played here? The move is not very tactical. The move that I played is b5. First, I need to kick out the knight from its square. Knight a5 can be possible in the game, which would force me to move my bishop back, but here, my brother played knight to e7, This knight to e7 move is asserting pressure on these light squares, but that is not very favorable for defending his position. As soon as I castled, you can notice that 90% of black's pieces are just very passive and stuck in their home squares. They are unable to do anything. Therefore, black tries to play h6 to kick out my bishop first, but hold on, I am the Stockfish 18 beta version, I can defeat my old version with limited opportunities. Therefore, as the godfather of chess, I decided to play rook to e1, getting access to this semi-open file. I also sacrificed the bishop, because I had the plan to play e6, which would pressure the king and queen simultaneously on the board with my bishop and rook. Do you know what the old version of Stockfish played here? It decided to capture. It noticed that e6 is coming to assert pressure on these squares. It said, "Go for this, my eldest brother, do whatever you can do. Let me pick up the bishop," and here, do you know what I played next? If you thought of considering the e6 move here, then congratulations, you are just wrong, because e6 is not so good. It creates pressure on these pieces, but after capture and recapture, black can eventually sacrifice his queen and later pick up the rook. If you count the pieces, he has 3 minor pieces for the queen, 2 knights for the rook and bishop, and 1 rook for 1 rook. This position will be just equal and may become a draw in later variations. So, we discovered that playing e6 is not so good. Therefore, I decided to play my 5000 rated genius move. Can you guess what move I considered here? The move that I considered here is bishop takes f7. Look at this move. It is just mind-blowing. Previously, I sacrificed my bishop, and now I am sacrificing my other bishop on f7. Have you ever watched a chess game like this? I don't even think so. Even the best chess players, including Magnus Ding, Kesh, and Hikaru, even if they think together, cannot play like me because my play is just full of crazy and brilliant, godlike chess moves. So here, black just captured the bishop on the f7 square. I mean, here, if black dares to capture the bishop on the f7 square, you can literally consider e6 to create problems for this king and queen. The king and queen will get slapped by the pawn. Therefore, back to the position. We discovered that black plays rook takes f7. Now, here, I consider e6, putting pressure on the queen and rook simultaneously on the board. The queen has only 1 square to go, and should you put the queen on d8? Let me show you the variation. If you do that, then after the rook captures and the capture happens, there is knight takes g5 check, and the king has 3 squares to go. If the king goes to the g6 square, you can literally consider knight to e6, which asserts the threat of playing queen to g4, while the rook can also go to the e6 square, making the king very vulnerable and suicidal. Therefore, back to the position, if the king goes back to the f8 square, then you can literally put your queen on the h5 square, and I will checkmate in just these squares. So, going back to the position, if the king goes back to the g8 square, then the problem will not be over for you. There is queen to b3 check, attacking the king, and as soon as the king moves, there is knight to f7 check, and later, I will pick up the queen, you will be left with no queen, become handicapped, and I will just defeat you. So, let me share an inspirational quote in sudden with you. We have to be honest about what we want and take risks rather than lie to ourselves and make excuses to stay in our comfort zone. So, going back to the position, we discovered that you cannot save your queen. Therefore, my brother dares to sacrifice his queen on the e6 square. He captures the pawn and gives me the opportunity to grab his queen with my rook. Now, we have bishop takes e6 and knight takes g5, attacking the rook and bishop simultaneously on the board. Here is a question mark for you: what move should you play? Many chess players, including you, might consider rook to f6, but that move is not very good because there is knight takes e6 as well, and after he captures my knight, the rook will be vulnerable because he is sitting back on these 2 horses, a horse is sitting on a horse, and then the rook is sitting on the 2 horses' backs, and then I will consider queen to b3, pinning down the rook, and many players might think of considering king to f7 to protect the rook, but here, from white's perspective, again, Full chess players might consider rook to e1 to attack the rook, but it is not so good because there is a d5 move as well to block the queen's diagonal. The best move for white would be to consider knight to e4. And then I will consider knight to g5, which will attack these vulnerable pieces. The king cannot go there because the f6 square is well protected by the knight, and I will later pick up the rook, and your position will be left with vulnerabilities. So, going back to the question, we discovered that any rook move, such as rook to f6, would be a very bad choice. That's the reason why we have bishop to c4 move on the board, sacrificing the rook on the board, and at this point, you can count the material. We have 3 minor pieces for the queen, a knight for the bishop, and a rook for a rook, which is materially equal. But hold on, I first played a4 to structure my pawn, and I have 3 connected pawns on the king side against 1, and watch my talent. How I turn this game from a draw to a winning position, which is an endgame for me. Black is trying to protect his position and threatening to consider any bishop e5, and now, we have rook to e1 and some exchanges on the board. The queen is under attack, and black is left with 2 pieces of a pair that are attacking the pawn, and a few moves later, we have rook to e7 to get access to the 7th rank, and a few moves later, we have h3 to protect the position so that the knight cannot do any invasion. And a few moves later, you can see we have queen to d2, where queen e2 can be possible to get access to this file, and a few moves later, you can see that the pawn on the d4 square is left unguarded. But should you capture the pawn on d4? Let me show you the variation. Here, I will consider rook to e7 to attack the pawn, and many players might think of moving back the bishop to the b6 square to protect the pawn, but it is a very vulnerable move because you have g5 to attack the knight, and after the knight moves, the dark square diagonal will be just clear and white for my queen, where I can play queen to b2 check, attacking the king, and as soon as the king moves back, I will capture the bishop, and you can see that if you capture my rook, I can capture your rook on h8. This variation will be just bad for you, and Stockfish 18 beta version is just winning because you cannot capture the pawn, and eventually, if I play with the black pieces from here, I can defeat Stockfish 17 if he plays with the white pieces, and that's the glory of Stockfish 18 beta, that each piece's version is just mind-blowing. Black wants to get his passed pawn, therefore, we have en passant to stop these pawns, and a few moves later, you can see that black put his pawn and bishop on his dark square, and we have some pieces and answers on the board, and the king was here, and you can see that black's position is very well secured, and how can I break it? Just wait and watch how I break it. Black is just trying to attack my pawn on the f3 square, and that is a very good way to attack me. And later, we exchanged the rooks on the e8 square. Still, black consists of 3 minor pieces against my queen, and I need to prove that I am better than him in the endgame, that he cannot do anything, and a few moves later, the pawn on d6 is left unguarded, but if I dare to capture it, there is bishop to c7, and he will win the game very soon because I will lose my queen. So, a few moves later, we have queen to a6 on the board to attack the bishop, and a few moves later, you can see this bishop's position has just become very vulnerable, unable to protect these 2 pawns at the same time, and that's what happened in the game. We have queen to b8, and later on the board, a few moves later, we have queen to c7 to attack the a5 pawn, and I pick up the pawn, and I make my passed pawn widely open on the a file, and this game is very winning for me because all I need to do is just push forward the pawn. You can see that the pawn on a4 is under attack by the bishop. Why did he capture the pawn? The reason is very simple, because there is queen to f4, which will exert pressure on the king and the bishop at the same time. We have bishop to c6, and a few moves later, I am just pushing forward my pawn, and later, I will threaten to win. I will threaten to promote into a new queen. A few moves later, I even push forward the pawn to the h5 square because I need another g-passed pawn on the other side of the board, and now, I must point out that black has to stop the g-pawn because the bishop cannot stop it at all. The king also cannot stop it because the queen is seizing the f-file. That's why, after black's turn, I win the knight, and a few moves later, you can see I even promoted into a new queen. And this position is completely winning for me because it is a queen versus bishop endgame, and I just need to checkmate black on the white squares, and that's what happened in the game. A few moves later, my king goes to the d3 square, and I need to checkmate black on the white squares, and I finally checkmated my brother, Stockfish 17. I hope you enjoyed the game very much. If you did, then don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and also, don't forget to visit my website, Rama. Wishing you all the best, bye bye, take care, and see you soon.